I said, good morning. Maybe I need to ask another question. How many of you are here? There we go. That's better. Well, it's great to see your smiling faces this morning. It's great to be back. I've got to tell you, this is, I think, my fifth or sixth time to Jakarta, and I've got to tell you, I love your church. I love the presence of the Lord that I feel here. I love your staff, and love your senior pastor and family. Dave reminded me last time, he says, remember, Jay, we are distant cousins, so we found out we're related somehow. How many of you find out that sometimes there are people that either you knew or they're a relative and you didn't know it, and it seems like it's a small world? There's people you find out that you never even knew. And how many of you know in this room right here, there's people here that you don't even know? Yeah. Well, you know, the advantage you have is that over the next 3 weeks, you're going to get to know me. But I don't get to know anything about you because you're out of here by the time I get done. Hopefully not before I get done. But I would like to find something out about you and let other people know something about you. So this is how we're going to do it. I'd like for everyone to stand up, if you would, please. Everybody stand up. Come on, join in. Now, if what I say pertains to you, then you sit down. Like if I say, sit down if you have purple eyes, then you sit down and everybody will go, weird. So here we go. Sit down if anyone has ever told you that you snore. Oh, we got a whole family affair right over here. That's cool. All right? All right, sit down if you've got the same socks on you had on yesterday. Oh, we got a couple here. That's good. All right, sit down if you had to check and see if they were yesterday's. All right, sit down if you've ever taken a chewed piece of gum and put it underneath a chair or a table. Or, oh, my word, look at, yes, every age. We've got young, we got old. All right, sit down if you've ever pulled one of those pieces off and chewed it. Oh, yes. Thank you for being honest. That was good. That was good. She's still chewing it today. I can see that. All right, stand up if you enjoyed the worship this morning. Yeah, good, good. All right. All right. Sit down if you should be on a diet. All right. Sit down if the person next to you should be on a diet. Oh, somebody just got hit. All right. Sit down if you consider yourself good looking. All right. Sit down if someone around you just lied. You're still standing, Mike. And, oh, almost got, sit down if you love the Lord this morning. Yeah, let's give yourselves a hand. Thank you. Hey, be praying for us over the next 2 weeks as we will visit some of our schools, going in and sharing the gospel in some of the schools around Jakarta. And look forward to being here even next weekend. I'll be in the kids area, and then the following week I'll be back in the pulpit here to share with you. But again, it's great to be with you today. I remember back, and I first should tell you, I've got 5 kids. Tanya, Shauna, Clayton, JJ, and Sadie. They're 34, 32, 31, 17, and 16. That's why I'm still in children's ministries. And one wife. One wife. But I'll never forget when my son Clayton, who's 31, he had come down with an infection called thrush. It's blisters in your mouth, in your throat, in your stomach. He was put into the hospital for a week. When he came out, he was doing okay. He was still running a high temperature. That night, we put him to bed, and about 1:30 in the morning, he got out of his crib and came into our bedroom. And when he came in, my wife felt his head, and he was still burning up with fever. She gave him some medicine, put him in bed with us. And I had dozed off to sleep when all of a sudden I heard my wife scream, OJ, turn on the light, turn on the light. And when I turned on the light, my son had gone into a seizure. I had never seen a seizure before, but there he was with his eyes wide open, but with his eyes rolled back, shaking uncontrollably. And I remember grabbing him, and then all of a sudden him going into that just dead stare, and I thought he was gone. And we rushed him to the hospital, and they began to work on him, and the doctor came out and said, look, your son should be okay. He's had what we call a grandma seizure, probably because of the temperature. We get his temperature down, we'll give him back to you, and then you can take him home. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, they handed Clayton back to us. We put him in the car seat, locked him in, and as I got on that road in California and got onto the highway, he went into a second seizure. I turned around, rushed back to the hospital. They grabbed him, rushed him in. And I can tell you that Debbie and I, as young parents, we were scared to death. And the doctor came back out and said, he should be okay. He's had another grandma seizure. And I looked at him as an ignorant young parent, and I said, Doc, how am I going to know? How am I going to know when he's home in his crib and I think he's laying there peacefully? How am I going to know whether he's actually alive or dead? And the doctor just kind of smiled and said, let me tell you how you'll know if he's alive. Well, a few years went by, nothing happened. And when Clayton was 4.5, he was in the house, and Debbie and I were outside. And as we walked in the house, Clayton was looking at us, his eyes rolled up into his head, and he fell back onto the carpet. And I ran over to that limp body, and I grabbed it, and I said, Clayton, look at me. No response. Clayton, look at me. No response. And then I remembered what the doctor said. If I wanted to know whether he was alive, and so I reached down to that main blood vessel that runs in the neck, and when I found it and put my hand on it, I could feel the pulse of the blood passing through his body. I reached down and put my hand in front of his nose and mouth, and I could feel the air coming in and out, and then I thought of something. I looked at that body, and I said, Clayton, if you're playing a trick on mommy and daddy, you stop right now or you are in deep trouble. And all of a sudden, those eyes rolled down. A little grin came across his face. He looked up at Debbie and I and then looked at me and said, Daddy, I was only playing. He is just like his mother. But how did I know he was alive? How did I know there was life there? It's for the fact that when I reached and I touched the blood, there was something that was saying, this is consistent. This is real. It's not stopping. It's life. It is real. It's consistent. It's going. You realize there are people today in Africa, in North America, South America, in Asia, in Indonesia, and right here in Jakarta that are walking around today saying, what can I touch that will give me life? What can I reach out and touch that won't be a high today and a low tomorrow? But what can I reach out and when I grab a hold of it, it's something that's saying this is real. It's life. It's not changing. It'll be with you, never leave you. I can tell you as Children's Ministry Specialist International, I'm in 10 to 12 countries a year ministering to kids and training leaders. But I've noticed as I've traveled around the world, as I've stepped into different countries and watched as people have reached out in many different ways to different religions or to different things, just looking for hope. It reminds me that as I stand here even today and I begin to lift my hands and worship God and worship, I was worshiping a God that's alive today. I was worshiping a God that when I cry out and I say, God, I need something today. I need life from you. He's there to say, I'm here. I'm not leaving. I'm consistent. I will always be with you. I will never forsake you. He's always there. I remember a saying growing up, hearing that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't always make him drink. But I'd like to change it today and say that if you don't lead a horse to water, he may never have a chance to drink. And that is why God has called us to be people who stand in the gap between heaven and hell, between the living and the dead, saying, God, use me. You know, I think it's wonderful that as we have a relationship with the Lord, starting with children all the way up through adults, that we work on our relationship with Him, that we learn to trust Him, we learn to follow Him, we learn to love Him, and that's great. But God says, once we learn of Him, it's not to just keep for ourselves, but it's to give to others. I grew up in a Christian home, and my parents taught me Bible stories from a little kid. And a story that they taught me, and one that I learned, and I still look at it and marvel at it, is a story of Jesus healing a crippled man. It comes from the book of Mark, chapter 1. A man that had no hope, that was looking for life, and what happened in his life. Read it with me if you'd like. Mark chapter 2, verse 1. And when he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. And many were gathered together so that there was no more room, not even at the door. And he was preaching the word to them, and they came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 men. And when they could not get near him because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him. And when they had made an opening, they let down the bed on which the paralytic lay. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, Son, your sins are forgiven. Now some of the scribes were sitting there questioning in their hearts, why does this man speak like that? He is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And immediately Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they had questioned within themselves, said to them, why do you question these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise, take up your bed and walk? But that you will know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He said to the paralytic, I say to you, rise, pick up your bed and go home. And he rose and immediately picked up his bed and went out before them all, so that they were all amazed, glorifying God, saying, we never saw anything like this. Here's a story that as you read, you see the power of Jesus. You see the power not only to be able to forgive, but to heal. And it's a great story, but I don't want you to miss one of the most important parts of the story that comes from verse 3. You see, yes, you see the power of God, but it would have never happened if it wasn't for verse 3, where it says, and they came bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 men. You look at this and you see that these men are not even mentioned by name. You don't even know who they are, but it's because of what they did that this man's life was changed forever. And this morning I want us to look at 3 things that I believe were a part of their life that need to be a part of our life today. You see this story where there's a paralytic. If you go into the history and look into it, you will find that many of the people that were crippled back then, because of the infections that were going on and the disease, they could still have feeling of pain, but not enough feeling to be able to walk or to move. And they say the only relief this man would probably ever have from the increasing pain that was ravishing his body was by death. And here he is, put out by his family on the side of the road like they did with many cripples, hoping for alms. And here's the story that people hear that Jesus is home, and you've got to understand that in that type of society, anytime there was a path where people would walk or travel, the people would build their house as close to that road as possible because they were an open society. Their door would be left open, so if someone needed something, they could come. They could come to the door. The only time you found a door closed when they wanted to have purpose of having privacy. But otherwise it was open. And here's Jesus. He's at home. People hear about it. They hear about the miracles. They see what's happening. And so people begin to gather. And here are four men. And I believe that they were probably friends. And all of a sudden together they get and they begin to say, hey, listen, we've got to get down to Jesus. He's in town. Let's see what's happening. And they walk out and they begin to travel. Hey, guys, come on, we got to hurry down. Whoa. Hold on. There's a crippled man here. He's begging, but guys, come here. We can't leave him here. Jesus is the healer. We can't leave him. We got to do something. All of a sudden you see that these four men, they were filled with compassion. They were filled with compassion. What is compassion? You go into the dictionary and you read, and this is what it says, that compassion, a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by misfortune, accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the suffering. In other words, I've got to do something. I've got to do something. It's where you have empathy. You are concerned, but then you want to move into the fact of saying, I want to alleviate it. I've got to do something. And these men, they had compassion. They had compassion. Let me tell you that compassion isn't something that is natural for everyone. You look at how people are made. There are some people that you see their love through service. They do things through service. Others by things they say. There are others that are just people of compassion. But I will tell you that it's something that all of us can have. It's something that all of us need. You look at Jesus. He was the master at compassion. You go into the Word and you look at what happens. Matthew 15. People hear that he's healing people, and they begin to gather up, not hundreds, but it ends up being 4,000 men and women and children that are not even counted. And he's healing those. Those that are lame now can walk. Those who are blind can see. Those who are deaf can hear. And after 3 days, it's time for them to go home. And Jesus turns to his disciples and goes, whoa, guys, we can't let them walk home. They haven't eaten for 3 days, and they will pass out on the way home. We must feed them. And the disciples say, oh, come on, Jesus, we don't have enough food to do anything. And it says that Jesus is moved with compassion. He thinks, I've got to do something. He says, what do we have? They said, well, let's see what we can gather up. We found 7 loaves, a couple fish. And because of compassion, he takes that and it multiplies until he feeds every single person there until their stomachs are full and they're left with 7 baskets full. He was moved with compassion. You go down to Matthew 20 where he's leaving Jericho and he's going along. And again, people are coming up. Can you heal us? Can you heal us? And they gather around when all of a sudden 2 blind men sitting on the side going, Master Jesus, have mercy on us, have mercy. And the other people turn and say, oh, shut up, leave him alone. He's got important things to do. It says that Jesus is moved with compassion. And he walks over and he lays his hand on their eyes. And all of a sudden they can see because he was moved with compassion. You go farther on in Mark 1 and you see that Jesus is walking along and there's a man with leprosy. People are saying, get away, unclean, get out of here. And the leper turns and sees Jesus and says, Jesus, I know what you can do. And if you're willing, you can heal me. And it says that Jesus is moved with compassion. And he turns to the leper and he says, yes, I am willing. Be healed. And the man is healed because of compassion. And folks, this is something that each one of us need and have to have in our life. We need to have compassion in our life. But you know what? We can have compassion and we can have the desire to alleviate, but it's whether we act on it or not. 8.5 years we lived in Nairobi, Kenya. I was responsible for 17 countries for children's ministries. And I can tell you, we would go into villages, a squatter's village of over 75,000 people in a square quarter mile. Go through there in a vehicle with a yellow gorilla costume and an orange gorilla costume, calling out in their language, Watoto, Watoto, Karibuni, kwa kanisa. Children, you are welcome to come to the church, to the tent. And we would see thousands of kids give their life to the Lord. We saw this happening, and then we would drive down the streets of Nairobi, and we loved the fact that we saw kids being saved. But you would drive down the roads, and I'm sitting here in the car with Shirley Gould, and we get stuck in the traffic, and she said, watch this. And all of a sudden, kids came walking up to the car, probably the same clothes they would wear every day. And with one hand behind their back and the other hand out, they would say, can you give me some money for food? The hand behind their back was holding a glue bottle where they would sniff the glue, trying to take away the hunger, not knowing that they were frying their brains. And to see Shirley roll down the window and say, no, I won't give you money, but how about a loaf of bread? And to see them go, oh, Asante Sana, thank you. And to see that over and over, but then to sit in a meeting and hear people talk about the street children, over 200,000 living on the streets, orphans, because their parents have died of AIDS or they have AIDS and the parents got rid of them. And over again to hear people say, there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do. And to see Shirley Gould stand up with tears coming down her face and say, but yes, there is something we can do. And Shirley began to have a burden, compassion for these kids, began to ask people if they would help build a house, and they were being pushed off by the churches there saying, it's not worth it. It's not worth helping them. But she began to gather the funds. She began to build the building. And I can tell you that 15 years ago, they opened up Kenya Kids, the home for street children. They would go out, they would gather up the kids that were there and say, would you like to come and live in a home? And I can tell you that through that place, not only did that compassion gain momentum, but now some of the churches, the Assemblies of God churches, they built group homes so that when the kids go to Kenya Kids and they can't get them back into their own Christian home of their tribe, they're sent to a group home where they keep them until they're 18 and they can make it on their own. Over 2,000 kids have gone through Kenya Kids, and not one of them have ever returned to the street, and every single one of them have given their life to Jesus Christ. I can tell you that David was a case of being put on the street at the age of 2. And at the age of 12, the Kenya Kids group pulled up, and people said, don't bother with them. But they pulled up and saw David there and said, David, Tapdali and Johapa. He came over and said, what do you want? They said, David, would you like to come to a home? And he said, I don't know. I've never been in a home. If you'll come, we'll take care of you. And so David got in that van. And when they got him there, they did what they did to every kid. They shaved his head bald. They get rid of all the lice and disease. And then they gave him something he had never had in his life, a hot shower. He stayed in there over 45 minutes because he had never felt the hot water coming down on his body like that. He also got 3 hot meals that day. And that night when they gave him his brand new pajamas and put him in his brand new bunk bed and into his brand new sheets, they went in to check on him later, and he had gotten out of bed and he was asleep on the floor. They woke him up and said, "David, why are you sleeping on the floor?" He looked and he said, "Miss Shirley, I've never slept in a bed. I don't want to get the sheets soiled or dirty." And Shirley said, "David, this is your bed. These are your sheets. These are your pajamas. Nobody is ever going to take that away from you." And they said he looked around in that room as he's laying in bed and said, "Miss Shirley, when I lived on the street, I heard people talk about a place called heaven and that it was supposed to be more beautiful than anything you could ever imagine. Miss Shirley, is this heaven?" She said, "No, but I'll tell you how you can get there someday." I want you to know not only did David give his life to the Lord, but a year ago, December, he graduated from the University of Nairobi. Today, he's studying to be a pastor. You see, when people said, "Don't worry about it," Shirley Gould was moved with compassion. And because of that, lives were changed. You see, not only was she moved by compassion, she realized she had to move then too. She had to put it into action. And folks, I will tell you, there'll be times that we can pray, "God, give me compassion." But you know what? Not only will there be compassion there, but God will give you the opportunity to be compassionate. It's up to you whether you are. I can tell you that when I went into children's ministries, I'd spent 5 years in professional entertainment, but I knew God had called me to the ministry. I didn't want to just share morals and values, but I wanted to share about Jesus Christ. And so my wife and I left the entertainment world, and I began to do kids' crusades. And then I was called to a church. "Will you come as a children's pastor?" And I went to this church of 1,500 people. And I began to build programs, and the pastor would say, "Do this or do that," and I would do it, and I had the applause of the pastor. I had the applause of the parents, and I felt very happy. And I left that church and went to another church of 2,000, and there the pastor wanted this done and that done. And as I began to build the programs and kids began to come, I felt successful. I had over 500 kids in my children's church. And on one Sunday, I watched as 2 boys and a girl walked in the door, brothers and a sister. Richard Castillo, his sister Teresa, and Danny, 12, 11, and 7. They came in, they sat down, we introduced them to everybody, and I watched as Teresa and Danny entered in, but Richard just sat in the back with his arms folded. Next week, the very same thing. The following week, the same thing. I couldn't get Richard to do anything. So when the mother came to pick them up, I said, "May I talk to you?" And she came over and I said, "I'm so glad to have your kids, but what's going on with Richard?" She said, "Jay, I must tell you what happened in our family." She said, "My husband was mixed up in drugs, and he was a drug dealer. And he decided to keep some for himself. And the drug lord broke into our house one night 2 years ago." She said, "He grabbed my husband, and the thugs that were with him grabbed my kids and myself and put us in the living room. And in front of me and in front of my 3 kids, they stabbed my husband to death. And my son is bitter and doesn't know what to do." She said, "Please, he needs a man in his life. He needs someone that will care about him. He needs that male figure. Will you do it?" And at that point, I was moved with compassion, and I said, "Yes, I will do that." I felt like God had said, "Do this." And I can tell you, I met with Richard on that Monday, and he was pretty hard. I met with him the next week, and he was still pretty hard. I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere, and it was the next Monday that my pastor walked in and said, hey, if you don't have anything to do this afternoon, you want to head out someplace with me? And I thought, senior pastor wants me to go with him. That's important. So I said, yeah, and I canceled that counseling appointment. The next week, something came up, and I canceled it again. And I felt like I should counsel him, but I kept putting it off. And I canceled the next 2 more weeks, and the mother didn't call back. And Richard never showed up again. His brother and sister did, but I thought, well, good luck to him. It was a year later, I was sitting at my breakfast table at our house. My wife had put the newspaper down, and I was eating my cereal, and I remember pulling it over and opening it. And on the front page of that newspaper was an 8x10 picture of a Spanish-looking boy that looked so familiar. And the title of it was 13-year-old Kills for Thrill. And I began to read the story of how a group of boys were out in the park, and a man happened to walk by and say, do you have a cigarette? And they said, not for you. And as he walked down into the park, Richard turned to his friends and said, it's his turn to die. And Richard Castillo, age 13, ran out and stabbed the man 7 times, and he died. And when I saw who it was, it was the boy that sat in my children's church. The boy that God had moved with compassion on me, but I was too worried about what the pastor would say. I was too worried that I would be accepted by others. I went to his court case, and he was sentenced to 11 years in prison. I stayed in contact with the family, but when he got out, he wanted nothing to do with me. You see, folks, compassion is something that we pray for and we need, but we need to realize that when compassion comes, it's got to be like the 4 men who said, we've got to do something. And what did they do? They did something. And folks, yes, our world is full of things all around us where we could be busy every second of our life with compassion things around us. But may I tell you, that I pray that God gives you spiritual ears and spiritual eyes, that when He moves upon you for compassion for a situation, whether it's somebody that needs a friend, whether it's somebody that needs a physical touch, a prayer, whatever it is, that you will be people that will move with compassion. You see, these 4 men, first, they walked and they said, whoa, he needs help. Come on, we've got to do something. And they pick him up and they begin to walk. And I can just see it. They're walking along when others are coming back and they're going, why are you coming back? You can't get close to the house. You can't even get there. And all of a sudden they say, oh, hold on. We know who Jesus is. We heard what He's done. We get Him close, He can heal this man. We know He can do that. You see, these 4 men were men of faith. They were men of faith. What is faith? So that faith, and the definition is faith is a complete confidence or trust in a person or thing or a belief not based on proof. Our Bible says that faith is a substance of things hoped for but not yet seen. It's when you say, I believe in this even though I don't see the result yet. And these 4 men were people of faith. You think about our world. You can open up the newspaper, and how many of you know you can be depressed just reading the newspaper? You can be depressed just seeing what's on television because there's things going on around us every day that says the world's ending, life isn't worth living, bad things are happening. But may I remind you, when the world says there is no hope, our God is the God of miracles. Our God is the God of hope. And when we put our eyes on Him and realize that when we believe that nothing is impossible, miracles can happen. Back in the 1930s, some of you may remember reading, and some of you may have been alive during that time, that the Great Depression hit America. And I can tell you that jobs, people had masters and doctor degrees. They couldn't even find a job. They were standing in soup lines just trying to get enough food to survive. And one day at the College of Berkeley, San Francisco, a rumor went out, and they found out it was true, that the assistant teacher head position at that school had left, and they were going to give that position away. And they said they would give it to whoever got the highest grade in the final mathematical test that was given. And I can tell you that they said everyone began to study very hard, including a man by the name of George Danzig. George wasn't the brightest, but he wasn't the dumbest. He was someone that made good grades, and he realized that maybe I may not be the top, but if I study hard, maybe I can get that. And he studied for 2, 3, 4 days every single night, trying to prepare for the final. And on the night before the final, he stayed up until about 4 in the morning, so tired that he decided he would lay down just for a few minutes. And he set whatever alarm he had. But how many of you have ever had the same feeling that George Danzig did when he never heard the alarm? And the true story says that when he wakes up, he realizes class has already begun. And he throws on the clothes, he runs over, and when he runs into the classroom, he sees that everyone's already working. He looks up and the professor has his head down. So George goes to his desk, sees the paper, turns it over, and realizes there are 8 problems on it. And then he looks up and he sees 2 more on the board. So he begins to write. He begins to erase. He feels like he got number 1 right. He goes on to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And just the time that he's finishing 8 and he's feeling good with only 2 more to go, the bell rings. And the professor says, "Time's up. Please come, turn your papers in. You're finished." And George's heart sinks. Everyone else begins to walk up, and to put their paper down, and he's feeling terrible, and he gets up, one of the last people to walk up and put his paper down, and he looked at the professor and he said, "Professor, can I ask you a question?" "Yes, George." "When are you leaving for the summer?" He said, I'm leaving Friday." "Why?" He said, "Is there any chance you would just give me until you leave or some set of time to finish the 2 problems?" The professor looked at him and said, "Sure, I'll give you until I leave." George thought, what a miracle. And so he goes home. He sleeps for a little bit, wakes up that Wednesday evening, and he begins to work on problem 9. He works, he cannot get it. He works through the night, gets a little bit of sleep, goes to 10. He can't get it. And he's ready to give up when he says, "Look it, they would not have been on the board if it wasn't possible to get them. Someone's going to get it right. Why can't it be me? Somebody in the classroom's going to get it." And so he worked, and finally he accomplishes 9. And that night into Thursday night, he works through the night. And finally, number 10, he finishes it. And the next morning, just barely walking, he walks in, and the professor's gone, and he lays the papers on his desk, and he goes back home, and he goes to sleep, and sleeps till Saturday morning. And Saturday morning, he hears a rap on his door. He gets up, half asleep, he goes to the door, and he opens it, and it's his professor. He said, "Hi, Professor, what's wrong?" And the professor looks at him and says, George Danzig, you have done mathematical history." He said, what are you talking about? He said, George, I forgot you came into the class late. He said, everyone had come in and sat down, and I said, students, your tests are problems 1 through 8. And when you finish them, please bring them up and put them on the table. I've enjoyed having you students for the last 4 years, and I don't know where life will take you, especially because of this depression. But I want you to know wherever you go, may God be with you. And as you travel through life, you may want to write down these 2 problems that have never been accomplished in history. Einstein went to his death not being able to finish these. And I doubt you will ever be able to finish them, but if you ever want to try, good luck. He said, I never put doubt in your mind. He said, nobody else has tried. You were the only one, and you got both of them right. You have done mathematical history. And I want you to know that George Danzig went on to get that assistant teacher's job. And then the Air Force of the United States stole him away, and he worked for them until he retired. You see, he didn't believe that it was impossible. He didn't think it was impossible, but he thought, if anybody can do it, I can do it. And folks, may I remind you that in the world we live in, it doesn't matter what's going on around you. When you walk with God, when you walk with Him, there is nothing impossible for God. There is nothing impossible. May I remind you this, that faith is not hoping God can, but it's knowing He will. It's not hoping whether He can, it's knowing He will, that our God can do that. And these 4 men, you see what happens. They say, hey, we got to do something. They pick him up. They begin to carry him. Man, when we get him to Jesus, Jesus is going to make a difference in his life. And you see, as they get closer, they carry him up. They can see the front door. Excuse me. Excuse me. Hey, get back. We are here first. Oh. And they try to get in a window. They try to get around. They're standing, they're scratching their head, and people go, hey, you might as well go back home. You're never getting in. You can see them look at each other, and they hear one of them say, hold on. Where there's a will, there's a way. And all of a sudden, they were filled with determination. Determination. They're filled with determination. What happens? They look around, and back then, when they built their homes, they built a flat roof. And there would be steps that would go up to it so that it was a place where they could have entertainment or have a meeting or just have a social atmosphere. And all of a sudden, they climb up. They get up there, and they're going, all right, guys, there's only one way to do this. I hope the people don't mind. We're going to tear their roof off. And all of a sudden, they begin to start pulling the manure and the mud and the sticks and the twigs and the leaves. When I get to heaven, I want to ask Jesus, what did you think when all this stuff started falling on your head? But all of a sudden, they tear it away and they lower him down. And when that happened, that man's life was changed because of determination. What is determination? Determination is a positive emotion that involves persevering towards a difficult goal in spite of obstacles. How would you like to be that ant? Determination. It's saying, you know what, I'm not going to give up. When we lived in Kenya, and I told you God opened many doors, we have seen hundreds of thousands of kids give their life to the Lord. This year, we've seen over 50,000 kids give their life to the Lord and go into discipleship. And I can tell you, living in Kenya, I believe that when we were there, that it made God happy to see what was happening, but it's made Satan ticked, upset. We lived in an African-made house. We were house sitting until the other house we were going to live in was ready. And it was a 3-story house that was a little crooked. We knew it was crooked because the little patio that was up on the stone front of it when it rained, all the water would go in that top and it would run down the stairs all the way to the bottom floor and go out the front door. Every window had metal bars on it. The door had a metal gate that would lock because of the thieves. The thievery was terrible. They would come with a rock and a potato sack, and if you had a wooden door, they'd just hit it on the wooden door and knock it off its hinges. And we had a bamboo fence, and then we had a swamp below, and the United Nations was off away from us. And there were nights we could hear the screams of this group that was breaking into all these homes. We had a guard that worked from 7 at night till 7 in the morning. His whole goal was to alert us if something happened and run over and hit the alarm. And when you hit it, it was a and hopefully the noise would scare him away. On November 14th, we were fast asleep when I heard, and I thought it was my alarm clock to get up. And I reached over and I began to hit it, and it didn't go off, and I looked, and it was 3 a.m., and then I did hear what was going on. I could hear the bars being hit with something powerful. I could hear the glass shattering. And all of a sudden, my wife looked at me, and I said, "Go get the kids." Then only 3 of our kids were born, and they were 5, 7, and 9. And she ran and grabbed them and went all the way up and tried to go through a little closet, through a hole up near a water tank up in the very top, but couldn't make it up. I ran to the bathroom window and yelling, "I'm wheezy, thieves, thieves!" And rocks began to hit my window. I went upstairs where Debbie was, and before I went, I looked down into the darkness. I knew they were coming up any second, and I yelled down, "What do you want?" And in broken Kenya English, it said, "Bring us keys, bring us keys." And I went up to where my wife was. She was just hanging up the phone. I said, "Who'd you call?" She said, "I called the police, and they said they'll come." And they did. 13 hours later, when they could get a ride. And we stood there scared to death, just saying, "God, please protect us." And all of a sudden, we waited, and the noise began to die down. And I didn't know what was happening, and I heard another little pebble hit the window, and I looked out, and I looked down, and it was my guard, Philip, and he looked up, he said, "Mzee, tafadhali Johapa, please come here. Sasa, now." I said, "Iko sawa sawa, is everything okay?" "Iko sawa sawa." So I went out, scared to death, and I got down there, and he had blood coming down the side of his face. And I said, "What happened?" And he told me that 15 men had come over the bamboo fence. And when they saw him, they began to stone him. They hit him in the head, and he got away and hit the alarm that's hidden and then hid in the bush. And they stoned the 5 dogs so they would not bark. And I said, "Why didn't they come in the house?" He said, "See, Jewy, I don't know." So I went around, and I could see all the mud up on the back porch and where the bars were. And you could see where they took the bolt cutter, and they cut the bar. One was out. The second one was out. And if they would have cut the third one, it would have opened a swing that would have let them all come in. But I saw the teeth mark on the front, on the top, but it wasn't cut. And I'm thinking, why didn't they cut it? And so I went around, came into the house, and walked downstairs. And when I got downstairs, I saw the muddy footprints where they took a child and put them through the window, and they went over and got our VCR and got it out. And I thought, why didn't they take anything else? Why didn't they cut the rest of the bars? I wondered what happened. Whoa. And I looked down on the floor, and I reached down, and when I lifted up a piece of metal, it was the blade to one side of the bolt cutter. The blade had snapped. And when it broke, it went flying into the house, and they could not cut anymore. And we began to thank God, and a few hours later, the mission came over. Instead of having half-inch bars, we put 1 1/4 inch bars on so they couldn't come back and get in. And we began to thank God for saving us. But it was 6 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from Indianapolis, Indiana, from a mother. And she wrote, "Dear Missionary J. Risner, you came to our church and you spoke. And not only did you give us a prayer card has our picture and our address and all that on it so they'll pray. He said, not only did you give all the adults prayer cards, but you gave all the kids prayer cards too. They were supposed to take one, but my son Andy, who was 9.5, took 3 cards. One for the bathroom, one for the refrigerator, and one that he carries to school every day to pray for you. Something happened on November 13th that we must tell you about. On November 13th, Andy came home and was very agitated and said, Mom, we got to pray for the Risners. We got to pray for them. She said, we pray for them every night before you go to bed. I know, but we got to pray now. So she said, well, Dad will be home in a few minutes, and then we'll pray. She said, my husband walked in 5 minutes to 7, and when he came in, my brother, Andy got his brothers and his sister and gathered them all up, and we began to pray. And every single one prayed, and when it got to Andy, Andy prayed, God, please protect the Risners. Please protect them behind the bars. She stopped and she looked and said, what do you mean behind the bars? Do you mean where people go and drink and dance and they have a good old time? He said, no, Mommy. Mommy, I was at school and I was getting ready to go out and play basketball. I'd promised the friends I'd play. And as I started out, I just felt that I was supposed to pray for the Risners. So I went over and sat down by the fence and pulled out the card when my friends came over and started saying, come on, you promised you'd play basketball. And he said, I almost gave in, but I knew I couldn't stop. I had to pray. And he said, as I began to pray, Mommy, I don't know what it was, but I saw a picture, and I saw the Risners standing on one side of bars. And there were men on the other side that were trying to break them, to get in, to hurt them, to kill them. Mommy, that's why we got to pray. And she said, I don't know if this will make sense to you, but on November 13th at 7:00 p.m., my family was praying for you, being led by our 9.5-year-old son. Folks, can I tell you that when it was 7 p.m. in Indianapolis, Indiana, USA, the exact time that it was 3 a.m., the exact minute that the alarm went off on our house that we were being robbed. A little boy, 9.5, was determined that he was going to pray. And yes, I give God the glory for the hundreds of thousands of kids that we've seen give their life to the Lord, but it may never have been possible if it wasn't for a 9.5-year-old boy that was determined that he was going to make a difference. Yes, those 4 men, not only did they say, we've got to do something, we have faith that Jesus is going to do something. Where there's a will, there's a way, and they begin to tear it away. And when they lowered it down, if you read the scripture, it says that Jesus looked up and said, because of their faith, young man, your sins are forgiven. And he goes on later and says, now, to show the authority I have, get up, take up your mat, you're healed, walk out of here. And his life was changed. Folks, if we're going to make a difference in this world, we have to be people that have to have compassion. We have to go where others will not go. We have to have faith in our own life and have faith for others that God can do the impossible. And we have to have determination. And if that will happen, God will look down into your lives and say, because of your faith, your determination, your compassion, lives are changed. Let that be your prayer today.